They called him the Shadow. It wasn't a compliment. At the Camp Lejeune Naval Medical Center Annex, a place of crisp uniforms and sharper salutes, Ben Carter was a ghost in worn, pale blue scrubs. For 2 years, he had shuffled through the corridors, his gait uneven from a limp he never explained, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that was easy to ignore. He restocked supply closets, changed bedpans, and mopped up spills others were too proud to acknowledge. He endured the casual cruelty of Dr. Preston Vance, the clinic's golden boy, who saw him as little more than ambulatory furniture. They didn't know about the sand-scoured nights in the Koringal, the taste of copper and dust, a permanent memory. They didn't know the hands that now wiped down stainless steel counters had once performed emergency cricothyrotomies in the back of a shaking Black Hawk, guided only by moonlight and muscle memory. They didn't expect the day when the measured beeps of the cardiac monitors would be drowned out by the staccato rhythm of automatic gunfire. Ben Carter wasn't a washed-up orderly. He wasn't the quiet, broken man they saw. He was a whisper in the halls of power, a name spoken with reverence in classified debriefs. The Shadow was about to show them the darkness he was born in. The air in the annex was a sterile cocktail of antiseptic, floor wax, and burnt coffee. It was a smell Ben had come to associate with a peculiar kind of peace, the peace of anonymity. Here he was no one. The weight of his past was a rucksack he could, for a few hours a day, set down in a locker. His world was confined to the supply room in the basement, a forgotten kingdom of gauze, saline bags, and stacked boxes of latex gloves. He found a rhythm in the inventory sheets, a quiet satisfaction in a perfectly organized shelf. It was a stark contrast to the chaos he had once thrived in, a life where inventory meant counting rounds of ammunition and morphine syrettes. This morning, the relative peace was shattered by the arrival of Dr. Vance. Preston Vance was everything Ben was not. He was tall, with a smile that belonged on a recruiting poster, and teeth whitened to a shade not found in nature. His scrubs were tailored, his Rolex a glint of gold against the pristine white cuff. He moved with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been truly tested, his voice a booming baritone that commanded attention. He found Ben in the main triage bay, carefully replacing a biohazard bag. "Shadow," Vance's voice cut through the low hum of the clinic. A few nurses, young and eager to please, tittered. The nickname had stuck, a casual piece of cruelty that Vance enjoyed wielding. "I need the Zoll X-Series defibrillator recalibrated and brought to Trauma Bay 2. And for God's sake, try not to drop it. It costs more than you'll make in a decade." Ben didn't look up. He simply finished tying the knot on the red bag, his movements slow and deliberate. His hands, though scarred and calloused, were steady. "Yes, sir," he rasped, the words scraping its way out of his throat, a relic of a shrapnel wound that had nearly stolen his voice entirely. Vance smirked, enjoying the performance of his own authority. "And get a move on. We have actual work to do today. I've got a consult with the colonel's wife about her tennis elbow. Very high stakes." The sycophantic laughter followed him as he swept away, leaving Ben in the wake of his expensive cologne. Ben stood, his left knee protesting with a familiar ache. He walked to the equipment locker, the limp more pronounced than usual. He didn't mind the work. He didn't even mind the insults. Not really. They were just noise. What bothered him was the incompetence he saw veiled by arrogance. He had seen Vance misdiagnose a simple tension pneumothorax as anxiety, had watched him fumble with an IV insertion on a dehydrated Marine until a more experienced corpsman had to quietly intervene. Vance had the credentials, Johns Hopkins, a prestigious residency, but he lacked the instinct, the feel for the precipice between life and death that couldn't be taught in a lecture hall. As he wheeled the heavy defibrillator out of the locker, a young nurse, Maria Davis, gave him a sympathetic look. She was new, still possessed of a kindness the Annex hadn't yet managed to grind out of her. "Don't listen to him, Ben," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "He's a jerk to everyone." Ben offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "He's the doctor, Nurse Davis. He can be whatever he wants." The rasp in his voice made the simple statement sound profound, ancient. He began the methodical process of checking the machine, his hands moving with an efficiency that belied his shuffling gait. He checked the battery, tested the charge, and verified the pediatric paddles were correctly stowed. His fingers traced the worn plastic, a familiar weight. He'd used an older model of this very machine to restart a man's heart on the deck of a listing destroyer during a typhoon. The memory was a flicker, a ghost of sea spray, and the ozone smell of a successful shock. He pushed it down. Here, he was just the shadow. He was just the man who cleaned up the messes. He delivered the recalibrated machine to Trauma Bay 2, the designated space for the most critical cases. It was empty now, a silent, sterile stage, waiting for its tragedy. The room was cold, the stainless steel gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. Ben felt a familiar, unwelcome hum under his skin. It was the feeling of a calm before the storm. It was a feeling he had learned, the hard way, to never ignore. The day wore on, a slow procession of routine complaints and minor injuries. A sprained ankle from the obstacle course, a case of heat exhaustion from a training drill, a PFC who had managed to get a fishhook stuck in his thumb. Dr. Vance handled each with a theatrical flourish, his voice echoing in the halls as he dispensed advice and prescriptions, ensuring everyone was aware of his presence, his importance. Ben remained in the background, a silent observer, moving from room to room, restocking, cleaning, being invisible. He noticed things others missed. The subtle tremor in a young Marine's hand as he insisted he was fine. The slight pallor on the face of a cook who complained of indigestion. He saw the tells, the small signals the body sends when it's under siege. He said nothing. It wasn't his place. His place was the supply closet, the mop bucket, the quiet corners where no one looked. Around 1400 hours, a series of loud, percussive thumps echoed from the direction of the main base, rattling the windows of the clinic. It was a deep, resonant sound, like a giant slamming a car door. Several nurses jumped. Dr. Vance, who was loudly regaling a captive audience about his weekend sailing trip, paused mid-sentence. "Demolitions training," he announced with an air of authority, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "They're always blowing something up. Scares the hell out of the new recruits every time." He laughed, and his loyal audience laughed with him. Ben, who had been wiping down a counter in the triage area, froze. His head tilted slightly, his eyes distant. That wasn't ordnance disposal. The sound was wrong. It was too deep, too rapid. It wasn't the controlled detonation of a training exercise. It was the concussive force of RPGs. He knew that sound intimately. He could feel it in the bones of his jaw, in the fillings of his teeth. His eyes scanned the clinic's layout automatically. Entrances, exits, cover, concealment. The mental mapping was instantaneous, a reflex carved into his psyche by years of survival. Nurse Davis noticed his stillness. "Ben, you okay?" You look like you've seen a ghost." His focus snapped back to her. The distant, hard look in his eyes softened, replaced by his usual placid mask. "Just a loud noise, ma'am," he rasped. But his body betrayed him. His weight had shifted to the balls of his feet. His hands, a moment ago relaxed, were now loosely curled. He was a spring, coiled and ready. A crackle came over the base-wide intercom system, followed by a voice strained with panic. "Attention all personnel. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. We have an active shooter situation at the main gate. All facilities initiate lockdown procedures immediately. Code black. Code black." The voice cut out, replaced by a piercing siren. For a heartbeat, the clinic was frozen in stunned silence. The air seemed to crystallize. Then, chaos erupted. Nurses screamed. A corpsman dropped a tray of instruments, the clatter unnaturally loud in the sudden tension. Dr. Vance's face went white. His booming confidence evaporated, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. "Lock the doors! Somebody lock the doors!" he shrieked, his voice a high-pitched, reedy thing. He scrambled towards his private office, fumbling with his keys, his only thought for his own safety. Ben didn't move. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He closed his eyes for a single, long second. The antiseptic smell was gone, replaced by the phantom scent of cordite and hot metal. The beeping monitors faded, replaced by the memory of shouting men and the whine of incoming rounds. It wasn't a memory. It was a return. He opened his eyes. The shadow was gone. In his place stood something else entirely, something cold, calm, and infinitely more dangerous. His limp seemed to vanish as he moved with a sudden, fluid grace. He wasn't shuffling anymore. He was stalking. His first stop was not a door, but the large, rolling cabinet of medical supplies. He bypassed the bandages and the antiseptics. His hands, moving with practiced speed, found what they were looking for. A full roll of heavy-duty medical tape, a pair of trauma shears, and a long, gleaming, stainless steel hemostat. These weren't tools for healing anymore. They were instruments. The world outside the annex's reinforced windows had descended into a cacophony of violence. The distant pop, pop, pop of small arms fire was getting closer, punctuated by shouting and the squeal of tires. Inside, the initial panic was congealing into a thick, terrified sludge. Dr. Vance had succeeded in locking himself in his office, his muffled shouts to "stay quiet," doing nothing to calm the terrified staff huddled in the main bay. Nurse Davis was trying to comfort a young corpsman who was openly weeping. Ben ignored them all. His focus was absolute. He moved to the main entrance, a set of heavy glass double doors. He peered through the reinforced glass, his eyes narrowed, scanning the approaches. He saw 2 Marines from the base's security detail taking cover behind a concrete planter, exchanging fire with unseen assailants. One of them, a young lance corporal with a shock of red hair, clutched his side, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his camis. "They're trying to flank us," Ben rasped, his voice low but carrying an undeniable weight of command. "They'll use the service entrance around the back." A senior nurse, a woman named Carol, who had worked at the clinic for 20 years, stared at him. "Who are you talking to? What are you doing?" Ben didn't answer. He was already moving. He strode to the rear service entrance, a solid steel door. He checked the lock, a standard commercial-grade deadbolt. Pathetic. He looked around, his eyes cataloguing every object. A heavy-duty floor polisher, a metal gurney, a fire extinguisher. He pointed the gurney at 2 terrified corpsmen. "Wedge that under the handle. Now." His tone wasn't a request, it was an order. They scrambled to obey, their fear of the chaos outside momentarily eclipsed by the strange authority radiating from the man they thought of as a janitor. Suddenly, the front glass doors exploded inward in a shower of tempered glass and shrapnel. A high-velocity round had punched through the lock mechanism. The two Marines outside were down. The red-haired Lance Corporal was crawling, trying to drag his wounded comrade to cover. Screams filled the clinic. Vance could be heard yelping in his office like a kicked dog. Ben didn't even flinch at the explosion. He was already moving back toward the front, keeping low. "Get down! Get away from the entrance!" he barked. His voice, though rough, cut through the panic like a blade. "Davis, get the trauma bay prepped.
I'm bringing in a casualty."
"We can't," she cried, her face pale with terror. "They're right outside." Ben's eyes met hers. The placid, empty gaze she was used to was gone. What looked back at her was cold, hard, and utterly focused. It was the look of a man staring down death and finding it unimpressive. "Prep the bay," he repeated, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. And then he did something no one could have possibly anticipated. He grabbed a rolling IV pole, a heavy steel one. He took a deep breath, and then he launched himself through the shattered remains of the front door. For a moment, he was a silhouette against the harsh afternoon light and the swirling dust. The gunmen, there were 3 of them near the entrance, dressed in mismatched tactical gear, were stunned by the move. They had expected cowering victims, not a counterattack from a man in scrubs wielding an IV pole. That hesitation cost them. Ben swung the pole in a vicious, horizontal arc. The weighted base connected with the side of the closest gunman's head with a sickening crunch. The man dropped without a sound. Ben didn't pause. He used the momentum of the swing to pivot, ramming the top of the pole into the chest of the second gunman, knocking him off balance. The third attacker raised his rifle, but he was too slow. Ben dropped the pole, closed the distance in 2 quick strides, and slammed the heel of his hand up under the man's chin. There was a sharp crack of bone, and the man collapsed, his rifle clattering to the pavement. It was over in less than 5 seconds. A whirlwind of brutal, efficient violence. He didn't spare the downed men a glance. He was already at the side of the wounded Lance Corporal, the one with red hair. "Stay with me, Marine," Ben rasped, his hands already at work, his trauma shears cutting through the blood-soaked uniform. "What's your name?" Gallagher," the young man gasped, his eyes wide with shock and pain. "All right, Gallagher."
"You're going to be fine."
Ben's assessment was instant. Sucking chest wound. Entry wound was high on the right pectoral. No exit wound visible. The man was breathing in short, panicked gasps, a frothy pink foam bubbling at his lips. Tension pneumothorax. His lung was collapsing, and every breath was pushing more air into his chest cavity, crushing his heart and his good lung. He had minutes, maybe less. Ben hooked his arms under Gallagher's shoulders and began dragging him back toward the clinic entrance. He was 180 pounds of dead weight, but Ben moved him as if he were a child. The staff inside stared, their faces a mixture of terror and utter disbelief. The quiet, limping orderly had just neutralized 3 armed hostiles with an IV pole and was now dragging a wounded Marine to safety. The world had turned upside down. The atmosphere inside the annex had shifted from panicked chaos to stunned, electric silence. The remaining staff stared at Ben as he hauled the grievously wounded Marine into the triage area, leaving a smear of blood on the freshly waxed floor. The sight of the 3 still figures lying outside the shattered entrance was surreal. Impossible. Dr. Vance, drawn out of his office by the sudden cessation of gunfire near the door, emerged, blinking, his face a mask of confusion. "What in God's name just happened?" he stammered, looking from the downed gunman to Ben. Did you do that?" Ben ignored him. He was focused entirely on Lance Corporal Gallagher, who was now laid out on the floor. The Marine's breathing was a ragged, desperate whistle. His face was turning a dusky blue. Cyanosis. The pressure in his chest was becoming critical. "I need a 14-gauge needle, a large-bore IV catheter, and a sterile prep kit," Ben commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. He didn't look at anyone in particular, but his tone implied immediate, unquestioning obedience.
Nurse Davis?
Shaken but professional, snapped into action. "On it," she said, already moving toward a supply cart. Vance stepped forward, a flicker of his old arrogance returning as he tried to reassert control. "Hold on just a minute. I'm the attending physician here. Everyone will do as I say." He knelt beside Gallagher, his movements clumsy and uncertain. He placed a stethoscope on the Marine's chest, listened for a moment, and paled. "No breath sounds on the right side. Tracheal deviation. It's a tension pneumothorax." He stated the diagnosis as if it were a brilliant discovery, not a screamingly obvious fact. "No shit," Ben rasped, not bothering to hide his contempt. "Get me the needle." Vance recoiled as if struck. "You will not speak to me that way, you janitor. I'll handle this." He fumbled in his pocket for a penlight, shining it in Gallagher's eyes. It was a pointless, time-wasting gesture. The man was suffocating.
There's no time, Doctor,
Ben said, his voice dropping to a dangerously calm level. The air seemed to get colder. "His heart is about to go into PEA. He's got maybe 60 seconds. "I am perfectly aware of the patient's condition," Vance snapped, his fear making him defensive and loud. "We need to prep for a formal chest tube insertion. Nurse, get me a thoracotomy tray and set up a sterile field." It was the correct procedure for a hospital. It was also a death sentence. It would take at least 5 to 10 minutes to set up, time Gallagher did not have. Nurse Davis returned with the needle Ben had requested and hesitated, looking between the furious, credentialed doctor and the quiet orderly who had suddenly become a battlefield commander. Ben didn't wait for her decision. He snatched the 14-gauge catheter from her hand. It was a long, thick needle designed for rapid fluid administration. In his hand, it became a life-saving weapon.
What do you think you're doing?
Vance shrieked, lunging forward to stop him. "That's not protocol. You'll puncture his lung. You'll kill him. I'll have you arrested for assault." Ben didn't hesitate. He didn't argue. He moved. With one hand, he shoved Vance backward, sending the doctor stumbling over a rolling stool and landing in an undignified heap on the floor. With the other, his movements became a blur of practiced economy. He located the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line, a spot he could have found blindfolded. He didn't bother with sterile prep. There was no time for such luxuries. He jammed the needle deep into Gallagher's chest, right over the top of the third rib. The sound was sickeningly distinct. A soft pop as the needle pierced the pleural space, followed immediately by a loud, sustained hiss. It was the sound of trapped air under immense pressure escaping the chest cavity. The effect on Gallagher was immediate and dramatic. The dusky blue color began to recede from his lips and face. He took a deep, shuddering gasp, a real breath. The desperate whistling in his throat subsided. The room was dead silent, save for the hiss of escaping air and the sudden, steady beep of the pulse oximeter that Nurse Davis had clipped to the Marine's finger. His oxygen saturation, which had been plummeting into the 70s, was climbing. 85, 90, 94%. Ben Carter, the quiet man they called the Shadow, had just saved a man's life with a needle and an act of blatant insubordination, all while a stunned Dr. Vance sat on the floor, gaping in disbelief. The man in the worn scrubs looked down at the doctor, his eyes like chips of flint. He hadn't just saved a life, he had seized command. The clinic, and everyone in it, was his now. The hiss of air from the catheter in Gallagher's chest slowly subsided. The Marine's breathing, while still shallow, was regular. The immediate crisis was averted. Ben worked with quiet efficiency, taping the catheter in place and starting a high-flow IV line in the man's arm, his movements sure and economical. The other staff watched, transfixed. They were seeing something they couldn't process. The hierarchy of the clinic, the rigid structure of doctors, nurses, and orderlies, had been shattered in less than a minute. Dr. Vance scrambled to his feet, his face a mottled canvas of fury and humiliation. His tailored scrubs were wrinkled, his hair disheveled. The thin veneer of his authority had been stripped away, and he was desperate to reclaim it. "You assaulted me!" he screeched, pointing a trembling finger at Ben. "You performed a procedure you are not qualified for. You're nothing but a goddamn nurse's aide. I'll see you in prison for this. You hear me? Prison!" Ben didn't even look at him. He was checking Gallagher's pulse, his fingers pressed against the man's carotid artery. "His pressure is stabilizing," he said to Nurse Davis, his voice a low rumble. "We need to get him on a monitor and get whole blood ready. Find out his type. If you can't, hang o-neg." He was issuing orders, and Davis was nodding, already moving to comply. She didn't even glance at Vance. This complete dismissal seemed to enrage Vance more than the physical shove had. He was a man accustomed to being the center of every room, and now he was being treated as irrelevant, an obstacle. "Are you all deaf? He's a menace. He could have killed that Marine. Security! Somebody call security!" The irony of his demand was lost on him. The security was either dead, wounded, or fighting for their lives outside. The clinic was an isolated bubble of relative safety in a sea of violence, a bubble secured by the very man Vance was trying to have arrested. A new burst of gunfire, closer this time, rattled the broken frame of the entrance. It was followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of something slamming against the rear service door, the one Ben had ordered barricaded. Thud, thud, thud. The metal gurney, wedged under the handle, groaned in protest. "They're at the back door!" a corpsman yelled, his voice cracking with fear. Vance's face went slack with terror once more. His personal outrage was instantly forgotten, replaced by primal fear. He looked wildly around, as if searching for a new place to hide. Ben rose to his full height. The limp was gone, erased by adrenaline and purpose. He moved with the predatory grace of a wolf. His eyes, which had been focused on his patient, now swept the room, assessing every person, every object, as either a resource or a liability. "You," he said, pointing to the two corpsmen who had barricaded the door. "Reinforce it. Use that floor polisher, anything heavy you can find. Pile it up." They obeyed without question. "You," he said to Nurse Carroll, the veteran nurse, "you're with me. We need to triage the people in the waiting room. Get them into the interior corridor, away from the windows." "And you," he said, his gaze finally falling on the sputtering Dr. Vance. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "You will stay out of my way. If you interfere, if you countermand one of my orders, I will sedate you and tie you to a chair. Am I understood?" It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of medical intent. It was a promise. The sheer, cold certainty in Ben's eyes made Vance take an involuntary step back. He opened his mouth to retort, to unleash another torrent of credentials and threats, but the words died in his throat. He saw something in Ben's expression that terrified him more than the gunman outside. It was the look of a man who had made promises like that before and had kept them. Ben turned his back on the doctor, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He grabbed a handful of bandages and a bottle of saline from a nearby cart. As he moved toward the waiting area to help Nurse Carol, he passed a small mirror on the wall. For a fleeting second, he caught his own reflection. The tired, anonymous face was gone. Staring back was a man he hadn't seen in 2 years. The eyes were older, haunted, but they held the same fire. It was the face of Senior Chief Petty Officer Benjamin Carter, the man they used to call Ares, the man who walked into hell and came back with his people. The clinic was his battlefield now, and he never, ever lost his battlefield. The rhythmic thudding against the rear service door intensified, the metal groaning with each impact. The gunmen were trying to breach their way in. The waiting room, which had been full of nervous patients and their families, was now a scene of controlled panic as Nurse Carol and Ben herded them into the central hallway, a windowless corridor that offered the best protection. An elderly woman was weeping quietly, while a young mother clutched her toddler, trying to shield him from the terrifying sounds. Ben moved among them, his raspy voice a strange source of calm. "Stay low," he instructed. "Keep quiet. We're going to be okay." He wasn't just offering platitudes, he was assessing them. Who was panicking? Who was steady? Who could be useful? Suddenly the firing outside changed in tone. The sporadic cracks of the attackers' weapons were answered by a new sound, a disciplined, powerful series of double taps. Pop, pop, pause. Pop, pop. It was controlled, professional, and utterly lethal. It was the sound of friendly forces. "Marines," Ben breathed, a flicker of relief crossing his face. He moved cautiously back toward the shattered front entrance, keeping to the shadows. He peered out. In the distance, he could see them, a fire team from the base's elite force recon unit, advancing in a textbook-bounding overwatch. They moved with a fluid, lethal grace that was achingly familiar to him. They were systematically eliminating the scattered pockets of hostiles. The assault on the clinic was over. The immediate threat from outside had been neutralized. But a new kind of tension was building inside. The arrival of the Marines meant rescue, but it also meant accountability. Questions would be asked. Reports would be filed. As the Force Recon team secured the perimeter around the clinic, a different kind of convoy arrived. 2 heavily armored Humvees screeched to a halt near the entrance, and from the lead vehicle stepped a figure that made every Marine in sight stand a little straighter. He was a man in his late 50s, tall and ramrod straight, wearing a crisp, starched uniform that was immaculate despite the chaos. On his collar, a single silver star gleamed. Brigadier General Marcus Thorne, the base commander. Thorne was a legend in the Marine Corps, a gravel-voiced veteran of a dozen conflicts. He moved with an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. His face was a mask of grim fury. This was his base. His Marines had been attacked, killed. His eyes, cold and blue as a winter sky, swept over the scene. The downed hostiles, the shattered clinic doors, the bodies of the guards. He strode toward the clinic entrance, his 2 aides scrambling to keep up. The Force Recon team leader, a young captain, met him and delivered a crisp salute. "Perimeter is secure, General. Hostiles neutralized or fled. We're clearing the area sector by sector." "Report on the clinic?" Thorne's voice was like rocks grinding together. "Unknown, sir," the captain replied. "We heard gunfire from inside earlier, but it's been quiet for the last 10 minutes. We were about to make entry." "I'll make entry," Thorne growled. "I want to see this for myself." He stepped over the threshold, his polished boots crunching on the broken glass. His eyes took in the scene, the terrified staff and patients huddled in the hall, the makeshift barricade at the rear door, the unconscious form of Lance Corporal Gallagher on the floor with a catheter sticking out of his chest, and Dr. Vance, who saw the arrival of a general as his moment of deliverance. Vance rushed forward, his face alight with righteous indignation. "General Thorne, thank God you're here, sir. This man," he pointed dramatically at Ben, who was now quietly checking Gallagher's IV drip. "He's insane. He assaulted me, took unauthorized control of my clinic, and performed a dangerous, unsanctioned procedure on that wounded Marine. He needs to be arrested immediately." General Thorne's cold gaze shifted from Vance to the patient on the floor. He knelt, his knees popping, and looked at the makeshift chest decompression. He looked at the stable vitals now displayed on the portable monitor Nurse Davis had connected. He looked at the pupil response in Gallagher's eyes. Then his gaze moved, slowly, across the room, finally landing on the man in the worn, blood-stained scrubs. The general's hard expression did not change. His eyes, however, did. The icy fury was replaced by something else entirely, a flicker of recognition, of disbelief, and then of profound, world-weary respect. The room was suffocatingly silent. Everyone watched, waiting for the general to act, to arrest the rogue orderly, to restore the proper order of things. Thorne rose to his feet. He ignored Dr. Vance completely, walking past him as if he were a piece of furniture. He walked straight toward Ben. The staff held their breath. This was it. The hammer was about to fall. The general stopped a foot in front of him. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other. The one-star general and the man they called the Shadow. Then Thorne spoke. His voice, for the first time, was not a growl. It was quiet, laced with an emotion no one could decipher. "Ben," he said, "what the hell are you doing here?" Ben Carter met his gaze. A small, weary smile touched the corners of his lips. "Just trying to keep my head down, Marcus," he rasped. "It didn't work out." The general let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh. He reached out and clasped Ben's shoulder. "No," he said, his voice full of an old, shared history. "I don't suppose it ever does for you." He turned to face the stunned, silent room. His eyes locked onto Dr. Vance, and the icy fury returned, magnified tenfold. "This man," he said, his voice now a low, terrifying thunder, his hand still on Ben's shoulder, "is Senior Chief Petty Officer Benjamin Carter. He is a Navy SEAL, formerly of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He is one of the most decorated combat medics in the entire United States Armed Forces. And the procedure he performed on my Marine, the one you were about to let die, is one he has taught to every top-tier medic from Fort Bragg to Coronado." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the weight of them crush the air from the room. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow. He is also a recipient of the Navy Cross and is currently under consideration for the Medal of Honor. So you will address him as Senior Chief or Sir. And then you will explain to me in excruciating detail why you tried to stop him from saving my Marine's life." The silence that followed General Thorne's pronouncement was absolute. It was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered every sound, every breath. The world had not just been turned upside down, it had been remade. The man they knew as the Shadow, the shuffling, quiet orderly, was a hero, a legend. And Dr. Vance, the paragon of authority and prestige, had just been publicly, catastrophically humiliated.
Vance's handsome face,
Which had been alight with vindictive triumph just moments before, crumpled. The color drained from it, leaving a pasty, sickly gray. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. He looked from the general's granite-hard face to Ben's impassive one. He saw the nurses, the corpsmen, the very people he had lorded over for years, staring at him with a mixture of shock and dawning contempt. His entire world, built on a foundation of credentials and arrogance, had just been demolished. I didn't know," he finally stammered, the words weak and pathetic. He's an orderly here. His file is sealed under a national security directive," Thorne cut him off, his voice like cracking ice. "A directive that is clearly above your pay grade, Doctor, but his skills are not a secret. They are written in the blood of the men he has saved and the enemies he has put down." Thorne's gaze dropped to the three still figures outside the clinic entrance. A fact he appears to have demonstrated again today. The general gestured to one of his aides, a stern-faced major. "Major, get statements from everyone. Confiscate the security recordings. I want a full report on my desk by 1800. He then turned his full, undivided attention back to Vance. "As for you, Doctor, you are to be confined to your office under guard. You will not speak to anyone. You will not touch a patient. You will not access any files. Your time at this facility, and likely your career in naval medicine, is over. Do you understand me?" Vance could only nod, his body trembling. The bravado, the arrogance, the booming voice, it had all been stripped away, leaving behind a small, frightened man. 2 armed Marines from the Force Recon team moved to flank him, their expressions unreadable, and escorted him to his office. The click of the door shutting behind him was like a gavel falling. With Vance removed, the tension in the room broke, replaced by a wave of awe and frantic activity. Medics from the arriving units began streaming in, setting up a proper casualty collection point. They moved around Ben with a new, profound deference. Nurse Davis, her eyes wide, approached him. "Senior Chief?" she asked, the title still sounding foreign on her lips. "What do you need for Corporal Gallagher?" Ben's focus returned instantly to his patient. The title, the revelation, it was just more noise. The mission was what mattered. "Let's get a proper chest tube in him now that we have time and a sterile field. And I want 2 units of whole blood on standby. He's stable, but he's lost a lot."
let's get him prepped for transport to the main hospital.
He began issuing a stream of calm, precise orders, and this time, everyone, from the junior corpsman to the newly arrived field surgeons, listened and obeyed without question. He was in his element, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of life-saving. He demonstrated the chest tube placement for a young Navy doctor, his scarred hands guiding the younger man's, his raspy voice explaining the nuances of the procedure with a clarity that no textbook could match. Amidst the controlled chaos, General Thorne stood to the side, watching. He saw the man he knew, the warrior they called Ares, hidden beneath the pale blue scrubs. He remembered a night in a dusty village in Helmand Province, watching this same man hold a dying Marine's hand, promising him he would see his daughter again, and then moving heaven and earth to keep that promise. He remembered the recommendation he had personally written for the Medal of Honor, detailing an act of courage so profound it bordered on suicidal, an act that had left Ben with the limp and the ruined voice, an act that had made Ben crave the anonymity he had sought here. When Gallagher was stabilized and being loaded onto a gurney for transport, Ben finally allowed himself a moment. He wiped the sweat and grime from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of dirt. He looked exhausted, older than his years, the weight of his past and the adrenaline of the present settling heavily on his shoulders. Thorne walked over to him, his expression softening. "You know, this quiet retirement thing really doesn't suit you, Ben." Ben let out a dry, rasping chuckle. "I was doing all right until the neighborhood got rough, Marcus." "It always does around you," Thorne said, a hint of a smile in his eyes. He looked at Ben's worn scrubs, the name tag that just said, Carter. "We need to get you out of this, get you properly debriefed." Ben shook his head. "There are still wounded, sir." He gestured to the other patients, the civilians who were being tended to by the medics. "My job's not done here." The general looked at him, at the unshakable sense of duty that defined him. Ben wasn't a SEAL because of the training or the title. He was a SEAL because when the world was ending, his first and only thought was to run toward the fire, to stand between the innocent and the flames. Thorne nodded slowly. "All right, Senior Chief, finish your work. But when you're done, we need to talk." The general knew this incident would change everything. The shadow could no longer stay in the dark. The hours that followed were a blur of organized motion. The Camp Lejeune Naval Medical Center Annex, which had been a site of terror and chaos, transformed into a model of military efficiency. Under Ben's quiet direction, the clinic became the central command post for medical operations on the entire east side of the base. Wounded Marines were brought in from other engagement areas, and he triaged them with a calm, discerning eye, sorting the walking wounded from those in desperate need of intervention. His raspy voice was a constant, steady presence, cutting through the noise and fear. He didn't just direct, he worked. He stitched a deep laceration on a young private's arm, his sutures small, neat, and perfect. He helped Nurse Davis and Nurse Carroll set up a makeshift pediatric area for the terrified children who had been caught in the lockdown, his large, scarred hands surprisingly gentle as he checked the little boy for shock. The staff of the clinic, who had once dismissed him, now followed his every move with a reverence usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. They saw the deep, ingrained knowledge in his every action, the way he could diagnose a patient's condition from across a room simply by the color of their skin and the rhythm of their breathing. It wasn't that he was a better doctor than Vance. It was that he was something else entirely. He was a healer, forged in the crucible of war, a man who understood that medicine wasn't just about science, it was about will. It was about imposing order on chaos, about staring into the abyss and refusing to let it take one more soul. Around 2,000 hours, as the last of the critical casualties were being airlifted to the main naval hospital, General Thorne returned. The base was secure, the last of the attackers either captured or dead. He found Ben in the now quiet triage bay, methodically cleaning his own blood-spattered hands in a basin. The water ran red. "The base is secure," Thorne said quietly. "Final count is 12 hostiles down, 3 captured. We lost 4 Marines, 17 wounded." Ben nodded, his expression grim. Every loss was a personal failure in his book. The guards at the entrance? Didn't make it, Thorne confirmed, his voice heavy. They bought you time. They died well. Ben closed his eyes for a moment. He had seen too many good men die. He finished washing his hands and dried them on a sterile towel. The exhaustion was etched deep into his face. Major Harrison has Vance in custody, Thorne continued. We've reviewed the security footage, all of it, from your takedown of the gunman at the door to your disagreement with the good doctor. He allowed himself a grim smile. The IG is going to have a field day with this. Vance is finished. He'll be lucky to avoid a court-martial for dereliction of duty and cowardice in the face of the enemy. He was scared, Ben rasped, showing a flicker of empathy that surprised the general. Not everyone is built for this. No, Thorne agreed, his eyes hard. They're not.
But they also aren't usually in charge.
You did good, Ben. You saved that young corporal's life. You saved everyone in this clinic. Ben just shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. He started to gather the soiled linens and discarded medical supplies, his old habits dying hard. Thorne put a hand on his arm to stop him. Leave it. Someone else can get that. He steered Ben toward the now empty waiting area and sat him down in a chair. I spoke with the CNO's office and the SECNAV. Ben stiffened. The Chief of Naval Operations and the Secretary of the Navy. This had gone all the way to the top. They're aware of the situation, Thorne said, choosing his words carefully. They agree that your cover is, shall we say, compromised. He paused. They want you back, Ben. Not in the field, but at Coronado, as a senior instructor for the 18 Deltas, teaching the new generation of special operations medics. Your experience, it's invaluable.
They can't let it go to waste cleaning floors in North Carolina.
Ben stared at his hands, at the scars that mapped a history of violence and healing. For 2 years, he had craved this silence, this anonymity. He had thought it was what he needed to heal the wounds that weren't physical. But today, when the chaos came, he hadn't felt fear or panic. He had felt alive. He had felt a sense of purpose he hadn't realized was missing until it was back. I'll think about it, he said, his voice low. You do that, Thorne said, understanding the weight of the decision. He stood up to leave, then paused. One more thing. Lance Corporal Gallagher. He's out of surgery. Stable. The surgeon said the field decompression was perfect, said whoever did it saved his life. He's asking to see the quiet nurse who saved him. A ghost of a smile touched Ben's lips. That was the only recognition that truly mattered. Not the medals, not the titles, not the awe in the eyes of the staff. It was the gratitude of the man who was still breathing because he had been there. I'll go see him, Ben rasped. As General Thorne walked away, leaving Ben alone in the quiet, damaged clinic, he knew the Shadow's time was over. But Senior Chief Benjamin Carter, the man they called Ares, was just getting started. The world had tried to let him rest, but the world, it seemed, still had need of a warrior who knew how to heal. 3 months later, the Camp Lejeune Naval Medical Center Annex bore few scars of the attack. The glass doors had been replaced, the walls repainted, the floors polished to a high sheen. But the atmosphere was irrevocably changed. A new sense of purpose and vigilance permeated the halls. Dr. Vance was a ghost of a different kind now, his name spoken only in hushed, cautionary tones. He had been dishonorably discharged from the Navy, his medical license revoked, pending a civilian inquiry. The sycophantic nurses, who had once orbited him, now worked with a quiet, chastened diligence. Nurse Davis had been promoted to charge nurse, her calm competence during the crisis having been noted in every after-action report. The clinic was better, stronger. Ben Carter was gone. His locker in the basement was empty. The supply closets remained perfectly organized, a silent testament to his time there. To the new staff, he was just a name, a legend whispered in the break room. The story of the quiet orderly who was secretly a war hero. But Ben wasn't gone. He was at the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, standing on a sun-drenched training field. He wore clean, crisp Navy fatigues, the insignia of a senior chief petty officer gleaming on his collar. His limp was still there, a permanent reminder of his history, but he no longer tried to hide it. It was part of him, like the rasp in his voice. He was surrounded by 24 young, impossibly fit sailors, the candidates for the Navy SEALs Elite Medic Program. They hung on his every word, their faces a mixture of awe and intense focus. Medicine in the field is not a science. It is an art form practiced in a hurricane. Ben's raspy voice cut across the quiet field. Your textbook will tell you to establish a sterile field. I'm telling you that sometimes the only sterile thing you'll have is the inside of the wrapper on a piece of gauze. Your manual will give you 10 steps. I'm telling you that you will have time for 3. You are not just medics. You are the lifeline. You are the promise every operator makes to his brother, that no matter what happens, you will do everything in your power to bring him home. He was a natural instructor. His stories from the field, told in his understated, gravelly tone, were more impactful than any training manual. He taught them not just the procedures, but the mindset, how to innovate with limited supplies, how to stay calm when your patient was your friend and he was bleeding out in your arms, how to make the impossible choice between 2 wounded men when you could only save 1. He was passing on the hard-won lessons of his life. He had found a new purpose, not in the silence of anonymity, but in the legacy he was building. One afternoon, after a grueling training session on mass casualty triage, a familiar figure approached him. It was General Thorne, now wearing civilian clothes, a golf shirt and slacks. He was retired, having passed the torch a month prior. "Senior Chief," Thorne said, a warm smile on his face. "Or should I call you Professor?" "Sir," Ben replied, a small smile of his own. "Good to see you." "I was in the area, wanted to see how you were settling in," Thorne said, his eyes scanning the young candidates who were now practicing tourniquet application with fierce determination. "Looks like you found your place." "It's good work," Ben admitted. "They're a good group." "The best," Thorne agreed. He handed Ben a small, official-looking envelope. "This came for you. I pulled some strings to deliver it personally." Ben took the envelope. It was from the Department of the Navy. He opened it and read the single sheet of paper inside. It was a formal notification. The review was complete. The President would be awarding him the Medal of Honor in a private ceremony next month for his actions in Helmand Province. He stared at the paper, his expression unreadable. He had never wanted it. He had done what he had to do for his men, for his brother-in-arms, who had fallen beside him. The medal felt like a weight. Thorne seemed to understand. "It's not for you, Ben," he said quietly. "It's for your family. It's for the men you saved. It's for the history books, so that people will know what men like you are willing to do. It's a symbol, and sometimes symbols are important." Ben folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. "Yes, sir." Before Thorne could leave, another visitor arrived at the edge of the training field. A young Marine in his dress blues, walking without a hint of a limp. His red hair was cut high and tight. It was Corporal Gallagher. He looked healthy, strong, his uniform adorned with a newly pinned purple heart. He approached Ben and General Thorne and snapped to the most rigid, perfect salute Ben had ever seen. "Senior Chief Carter," Gallagher said, his voice clear and strong. "I was hoping I might find you here, sir." Ben returned the salute. "Corporal,
Good to see you on your feet.
thanks to you, sir," Gallagher said, his eyes shining with an emotion that went beyond gratitude. "They told me what you did, what you risked. I don't have the words to thank you." "You're standing here, Corporal. That's all the thanks I need," Ben rasped. "How are you feeling?" 100%, sir. Re-enlisted last week. They're putting me on instructor duty at Paris Island for a while." He paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crudely carved object. It was a piece of wood, whittled into the shape of a trident. "It's not much, sir. I made it while I was recovering. I wanted you to have it." Ben took the small wooden trident. It was rough, imperfect, but it was made with care. It felt heavier than any medal. It was a token from a life he had refused to let be extinguished. He closed his hand around it.
Thank you, Corporal,
he said, his voice thick with a rare emotion. "I'll keep it." Gallagher beamed, his duty done. He saluted once more, gave a respectful nod to the retired general, and walked away, a living, breathing testament to the day the shadow stepped into the light. Ben stood there, the setting California sun warming his face, watching the next generation of heroes train. He held the small wooden trident in his hand, a symbol of a life saved, and looked at the future he was now responsible for shaping. He had learned that true service wasn't about hiding from the world, but about finding your place in it. Sometimes the quietest men have the loudest stories to tell. And for those willing to look past the surface, past the worn scrubs and the tired eyes, they might just find the hero they never knew they needed.